Philanthropy is a growing space in Africa, so people came from all walks of life to unpack it. It all began on the 16th of May at the Wits Business School.
A workshop on philanthropy in Africa, assessing the state of the field and how giving can be more impactful. It was an intriguing idea, but I know nothing about philanthropy. So I turned to two people I know who know a lot about philanthropy. To Becky, who was transitioning from Southern African Trust to WITS to head the Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment, and to Brima Sal, who was transitioning from heading Codestria to head Trust Africa. So the partners, the partnership of two became a partnership of four. The workshop became a conference, and the result is the remarkable program we see for today. So let me invite Mrs. Masiyiwa to share a few remarks. So I'll turn it over to Mrs. Masiyiwa.
I remember being in a presentation where somebody showed newspaper clips in 1970 of what the world was saying about China. Pretty much what they're writing about Africa, the demographic bulge, what are we going to do in 2050, the African population doubles, etc., etc. So my question is, what are we going to learn? If we look at the impact of mobile cellular phone technology on the continent, look at where the US is. We all started at zero, new technology, and then look at the surge. Africa has kept pace with everybody else. There's something that happened within governments, private sector, public sector, philanthropy, civil society. That was an enabler. And then also the role of philanthropy. How do we catalyze that creativity, that innovative space to ensure that we have the same kind of impact on the GDP as we've had on mobile telephones? And lastly, I just want to say congratulations to our partners for putting this all together and for the opportunity to see a seed, an idea become a reality through this two-day conference.
I think we are excited to be here. This has been a long journey, as Emmanuel said, for a number of us. A number of us are working in philanthropic institutions. We are teaching, we are practicing, but as you know, there has been no dedicated institution in Africa that teaches philanthropy. And the entire continent is practicing philanthropy, has lived philanthropy, but has not been teaching it as part of its curriculum. That should really be telling us something about ourselves and the need for a platform like this. Secondly, the reason why we're excited is because as the sector, we also need to be capacitated in many ways. And some of us have been going to overseas institutions to be capacitated on philanthropy. I'm one of those individuals. I've gone to, I'll probably say, 2 institutions, and I'm happy that those institutions are represented here. So I've gone to Lilly School of Philanthropy, go and start philanthropy and understand how they approach the research, the design, and the study of philanthropy. I also went to the City University of Muyo to study community foundations. But we should be offering some of these things here. So as the center and WPS here, we are very excited to host you. This is not an official welcome. We are going to be welcomed by the Vice Chancellor sometime later. But we are excited because, as you know, we were established to fill some gaps in the continent. And some of these gaps included the lack of data and knowledge, particularly in the field of philanthropy and social investment. If you ask a lot of us today to give you a sense of what philanthropy looks like, you would not find a coherent or even a place where you could say we can all go to this place to find this data. You have to look for it from very scattered places. And our hope as the center is to become that place that could interpret the field.
Mrs. Sivio talked about many things, including the problem of inequality and growing inequalities that exist on this continent, and the need to build inclusive societies. You know that we often talk about the rising continent where 6 or 5 of the fastest growing economies are the African continent, but 6 of the most unequal societies are also on the African continent in the world, including this country where we're speaking from. The civic space has, the power of philanthropy is actually its ability to address many of the challenges that we are talking about, many of the critical issues, including supporting the struggles for democracy and for building, for transformation and building inclusive societies. There are a lot of new actors in this field of philanthropy itself, but also the civic space has new actors, new citizens movements, and looking at what happened on the continent since the so-called Arab Spring in 2009, 2010, 11. To now, most of the changes on the political sphere have been led by movements of young people. Last year, about 50 of them convened in Dakar in something like a summer school from 23 countries, 50 movements from 23 countries, from Madagascar to Senegal and all parts of Africa. With a view to networking and exchanging and helping to understand issues in a common perspective.
When I left Trust Africa, I had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Masiwa. I call it Tsitsi. And we sort of conspired to study foundations across Africa because we wanted to understand. We keep on talking about it, that we see foundations coming up. We wanted to understand more the internal dynamics within those foundations, how they're set up, are they fit for purpose, what are they doing. But speaking to what is now used in development parlance, domestic resource mobilization. And now we begin to say these foundations in aggregate are giving over $2 billion each and every year. So they're playing a huge role. So what are they responding to? These foundations cut across. They come from, you're going to find they're mostly addressing social problems around access to education, access to health, access to housing, and also you're going to find them engaged in infrastructure projects. You're going to find them engaged in welfare projects where they actually, the Dangote Foundation has started to experiment with giving small grants to women traders, etc. across Nigeria. But I believe the CEO of the Dangote Foundation is here, so we'll learn more about what they are doing. Then they also support advocacy. Advocacy work was one of the critiques that we made about them was to say maybe these foundations are mostly focused on they avoid issues to do with policy, because the argument has been made that most of these foundations are established by high net worth individuals who have a causal relationship with government, so they can rarely speak truth to power. But we've seen them through their interventions beginning to support advocacy around issues to do with social justice, to do with accountability, etc. Moving into spaces where we found traditional Northern foundations sort of active in. Then they also provide support towards what we've begun to see, networking. 5 minutes already. Okay. So we were looking at saying, so how do they communicate availability of grants? I would have shown you the chart quickly that most of them do this call for proposals, etc. And also we begin to say, what is this average size of the grant? I think organizations like Trust Africa that will also put in that cohort become outliers in terms of some of the large grants that Trust Africa was issuing at the time that we were carrying out these studies. But we find that the average grant is in the region of 15 to 20,000. They issue grants. Because one of the things that we've always said is that maybe these foundations, they take this money and they use it for themselves. They also collaborate with others. They mostly collaborate with local NGOs at a village and district level. They also collaborate, and we've seen them actively collaborating either in the APF space or the APN space, the African Philanthropy Forum space and the African Philanthropy Network. And they collaborate either as joint implementation partners or also as joint funders. So one of the things that we saw, especially with the Dangote Foundation, coming on the table to partner with the Gates Foundation around dealing with an epidemic that was in Nigeria, and also them being sort of mobilized around the Ebola crisis by the then commissioner of the African African Union, Nkosazana Zuma, bringing them to say, let's respond to the Ebola crisis as African high net worth individuals. We saw them beginning to play their part, because normally what Africa's story has always been, in cases of such disasters, we find ourselves having to extend a begging bowl outside. But that was one of the sort of major disruptions that we've seen. In Zimbabwe, for instance, now we've had two major sort of disasters, the cholera disaster in 2018 and Idai in 2019. And I'm glad to announce that we saw Higher Life Foundation playing a huge role in terms of mobilizing resources and also issuing a challenge fund to match whatever donations will be given. So these are very important for us to understand. But these foundations also, in a set of way, they also mimic their counterparts from the West, their boards, etc. What was fascinating is the foundations that are run, and there's a close relationship with the founders. The boards tend to be smaller. While it's those that are not associated with the founder, they have huge boards. And I don't know what it means in terms of strategy, etc. But all of them are carrying out this issue about carrying out strategies, developing these strategies, etc. But one thing that we saw, in particular the Tony Elumelu, the Dangote Foundation and Higher Life, is their responsiveness to disasters. So for instance, when we did disaster in Sierra Leone, Tony Elumelu was the first one to respond, to say we are going to issue a grant to the government of Sierra Leone to respond to the mudslide that had happened. And also in Zimbabwe, we saw Higher Life Foundation responding as a first responder, because the challenge that we've always had with foundations, the big foundations, is the manner in which they respond to changes in the environment. So the relationship, then what we're going to, that we further interrogate is to say, does the existence or the activity of the founder in the foundation help them to be more nimble?
But it's an ongoing study. We've published a book, yes, but we're continuing the case studies, especially for Betty's benefit and his center, because if you're going to be studying African philanthropy, you need these case studies. And they're living case studies. For instance, I had to update my case study on Higher Life and on the Tony Elumelu Foundation this year, given the changes that they've done in terms of their strategies, etc. So I would say that in terms of my conclusion, there are three things that I would say, because one of the arguments that when we make such presentations, counterparts from the North say, so you no longer need Northern foundations. No. We still need Northern philanthropy. Because I think there's a huge space for complementarity to begin to complement, to begin to ensure that there's a conversation between the Northern foundations and the foundations that are emerging out of the continent. And that is number one. And number two, I think the collaboration is still limited, especially for some of us who come from the social and economic justice space, where we're dealing with hard issues to do with governance, democracy, and issues such as illicit financial flows. That can be very difficult to unravel in a nation or at a regional level. And this is where we are not seeing African foundations coming in and making an investment. While at least we're trying to deal with systemic issues, the softer issues of policy. Then finally, we find that these foundations are yet to open up for study. They are yet to be comfortable to be interrogated. So one of the things that they'll never tell you is how much money they have put. They're very silent on that. But it actually speaks to something that is very positive about them, because none of these foundations that we studied gave because of a tax incentive. None of them. Because the tax incentive regime for foundations in Africa is not as vibrant as what you find, say, in the US, etc. So when I interviewed Tshikululu for this study, she was saying it's not even about that, because when we started the foundation, we didn't even have money. And you know that in America, you first of all make the billions, then you make the foundation. But here at times, you actually, before you make the money, you establish the foundation. Like I can see you. Thank you very much.
Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. For those of you who don't know, the Lilly Family School is the world's first school on philanthropy, and it has the word family in the name, which means all of you are welcome, and Becky's also part of our family already, and it's been exciting to see the center here launch. Okay, so where do we start? It turns out I'm an economist, so I'm very interested in the data and the numbers. And when we look at the data on where we are on the African continent, and even in development more broadly, you hear statistics like there's a $2.5 trillion gap. I didn't say million, I didn't say billion, but I said trillion in terms of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So what does that mean globally? Where are those resources going to come from? Increasingly, the private sector is going to be part of that conversation. In other words, governments in Africa and throughout the world cannot do this on their own. And so with that, there's an increasing attention to private philanthropy. So that's one set of reasons. The other set of reasons to pay attention is we have an unprecedented number of crises. I don't have to tell you this. Whether you look at the natural disasters in Mozambique earlier this year, you look at refugee crises throughout the continent, and we heard it's not just international, it's also internal. And then we turn to issues like gender equity that are ongoing, healthcare, education, the arts. The list is endless. Where are we going to get the resources to address these challenges? And many of them are multiple crises happening at the same time. So philanthropy has to be part of the conversation in the African context. And today, we see that politicians, governments across the continent are starting to recognize philanthropy. I'll just mention a few examples. So Liberia, Rwanda, and Ethiopia, just a few examples who've incorporated private philanthropy into their national development plans. With the number of transitions going on here in South Africa, we just had an election, Nigeria, etc. There's also an interest in how private philanthropy can play a role as a catalyst for innovation, to help build bridges, and to help restore hope and strengthen civil society. So one other point to make is that I think one of the most important reasons to put philanthropy on the agenda today is that Africa has a lot to teach the world on this topic. And we've been absent from that conversation. I think it's time to change that. When we look at African philanthropy, it extends across all communities, all different income levels. We have philanthropy that takes place at the family, intra-household level, but even between communities. Religious giving is part of it. We'll hear more about that. And the diaspora also has a role to play. But most of those stories are locked up in our own communities. We haven't been able to share them widely. And I feel so strongly about that I've actually taken it upon myself to make this one of my personal missions, to make sure that we collect better data about African philanthropy and that we share this knowledge broadly. It's not just about learning from the rest of the world. We have a lot to teach the rest of the world. But this is where the challenge lies. Data on African philanthropy is so scarce. I don't have to tell anybody in this room. Existing data, as you heard, is very limited, and most of the time it just focuses on perhaps foundations. And we know that foundations are just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much going on at the grassroots level, at the diaspora level, and much of this has not even been captured or studied. When we talk about philanthropy at the Lilly Family School, we often talk about the multifaceted and complex nature of it. And in particular, you've heard about the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. And I have added a 4th T to that, and that's testimony. How do we share our stories? How do we tell our own stories? And so that's part of the conversation. To build this knowledge, we need everybody in this room working together. We've taken the first step at the Lilly Family School. We just released a brand new index called the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. I'm going to just share a few quick highlights from that. And sorry, can you load the video perhaps? Thank you. All right, so the Global Philanthropy Environment Index is the very first time we have brought together knowledge on the environment around the enabling environment in philanthropy. So the question is, Africa is a philanthropic continent. We all know that. How do we show that? How do we demonstrate that? Where is the data? That's a question for all of you. And then conversely, what's holding philanthropy back in Africa? What could we collectively do to move the needle, to unleash the resources that are needed to solve the pressing challenges of our time? So the Global Philanthropy Environment allows us to do that by looking at 5 different components of the enabling environment. The very first one is the ease of operating. How easy is it to operate a philanthropic organization? Starting one, what are the rules and regulations? How do you keep it operational? Does the government interfere? Tax incentives are the second component. We look at whether they're incentives or barriers from the regulatory environment. We also look, in addition to that, at cross-border flows. We heard from Mrs. M yesterday about the difficulty of giving in foreign currency or even transferring resources across borders. This is something we have to do a better job at. The European Union has figured this out. There's no reason why the African Union cannot. So that should be high on our agenda. And then the political environment is also one of the factors that we measure. And perhaps most importantly, we do not omit the sociocultural environment. And it turns out, when we look around the world, that is the factor that varies the least. In other words, every culture around the world is philanthropic. Let's make no mistakes today. Philanthropy is not something that just belongs to one region, one race, one ethnicity. It's something that all of us participate in. It's part of the human condition.
We are primarily a US-based network of private philanthropy that funds in Africa. And within the philanthropy support organization landscape in the United States, we're the only geographically focused funder network. So that makes us, in many ways, a kind of strange bird. So the main reason for what we affectionately call as AGAG is that we bring together funders who are funding in Africa, whose funding targets African communities, whether they're specifically focused on countries or on regions. Also, we look at funding that is focused on international, broader, sort of global initiatives as well. But our main reason is really to bring together practitioners and to help people to understand the context of their funding. To basically say that Africa is not a country, that because you fund in Kenya does not mean that what you're doing in Kenya is going to work in Ghana. And to really encourage funders to understand better the context of where they're funding, what it is that they're trying to do. We did some research in 2015. We commissioned the Foundation Center to do actually the first ever examination of US foundation funding specifically geared toward Africa. And in 2015, for our 15th anniversary, we asked the Foundation Center to do an analysis of their data set, which is the top 1,000 private foundations in the US. And this top 1,000 represents about 75% of the international funding in terms of US foundations. And we asked them to give us an idea of how the funding targeting Africa fits within that. What we asked the Foundation Center to do for us was to not so much follow the money, but to look at the money that was going to what we term Africa headquartered organizations. And the reason why we used that terminology is that we wanted to make a distinction between international NGOs that were based in an African country and an African organization that had its headquarters here on the continent. And we asked them to look at the amount of support that was going to Africa headquartered organizations. And one of the reasons why we're interested in following this is because within AGAG's discussions over the years, our colleagues from the continent had repeatedly talked about the issue of funding that was not really reaching organizations based in Africa, one. Two, whether or not Africa-focused funding was really building the capacity of African organizations or building the capacity of international organizations that were working in Africa. And whether or not the kinds of priorities that private funders were pursuing were really in line with the types of priorities that communities had. And so one of the interesting things about the funding that went to African headquartered organizations was that about 25% of the funding went to African headquartered organizations. Now within that data set, you also have funding that's going to like WHO and large initiatives that benefit Africa. But it was really clear that the large majority of the funding that is going to target Africa isn't really going to organizations that are headquartered in Africa. The other thing that was really interesting about that was when we looked at the time period, and again, this is just a small subset of American foundations, this data set about the top 1,000. One of the other things that was really interesting is that looking from 2000 to 2012, the percentage of money that was going to African headquartered organizations actually declined. over that period of time. And the other thing in terms of looking at the type of support, because again, this was something that had also emerged during the discussions within AGAG, is the feeling that project support was missing the mark because it wasn't allowing organizations to strengthen themselves. And the data showed that about 91% of the money was going for project support. So these were some of the things that we wanted to unearth, to sort of look at and understand in terms of American foundation private funding. And it's not only foundations, it also includes grant-making public charities as well. But one of the reasons why we wanted to do this research is that we wanted to really look at attitudes, not so much money. Because we also feel that when you change institutions by changing the people who are in them. And how you change people in them is by building relationships. And so one of the things that we've been very happy about, as Becky mentioned, in 2008, we did a conference here in Johannesburg, and since that time, we've also engaged African-based grantmakers as part of the AGAG network. And that involvement has really changed the AGAG network. It's changed who's at the table when the discussions are being had. It's changed the quality and I think the depth of the conversation. And I think it's also influenced some of the funding organizations that have been a part of the AGAG network over the years. Another thing that I think has been really important is to look at how that has translated into practice. So fast forward recently, last year, we did a survey in which we contacted about 100 foundations, 54 of them responded. And one of the things we were really interested in was whether or not, if you were a US foundation, there were major impediments to you partnering with or funding African-based organizations. And if so, what were those impediments? We also wanted to find out if, for those who were engaged in any collaborative partnerships, how many of those collaborative partnerships were with African-based organizations. So one of the things that AGAG has really been trying to do is to create stronger relationships between organizations that fund based inside and outside of Africa. And I think for us, one of the things we feel is that the growth and development of the field of African philanthropy must have an impact on the way in which American foundations fund in Africa. And there's no reason for it not to, because one of the things that we have demonstrated through our partnership with our members who are based on the US and other institutions like the Center, like the African Philanthropy Network and the East African Philanthropy Network, is that if you understand and know the resources that are available to you to be able to pursue those partnerships, then you really don't have any reason for saying that you can't do it. And one of the things that we say within AGAG is just because you don't know about it, you can't say it doesn't exist. And so what's really important is for you to do the work, to connect with the people who can give you the information. So if you're interested in pursuing partnerships, or you're interested in pursuing collaborations, that you can do that with institutions who have a knowledge and expertise about what's going on.
In South Africa, philanthropists, be it individuals or corporates, unions that have set up social investment trusts or community BE trusts, are really spoiled for choice when it comes to where to invest and to make a difference. The needs are endless, but so too are the opportunities for positive social impact. Many donors in South Africa have a preference for funding educational initiatives, and rightly so. Donors are also more inclined to make larger and long-term investments, which is important to ensure the sustainability of initiatives and to measure long-term outcomes. However, the move in recent years to shift towards our funding towards more educational and systemic interventions has resulted in funding gaps in other areas. And these include funding for people with special needs, sustainable livelihoods, charitable giving, or as I prefer to refer to it, as initiatives that catch those that are not supported by state funding, environmental conservation, disaster relief, and just as important, advocacy and think tank groups, lobby groups, policy units, and faith-based organizations that strengthen our democracy and build social cohesion. And so I want to end and go back to Professor Leo Pascalia. And one of the early lessons that I learned in my work about our collective role in society. And philanthropy is about a very deep philosophical, strategic, and a deliberate choice about actively doing in order to make a positive social impact in our societies. And as investors, we know that the needs will always be endless, but slowly, step by step, we can make a starfish difference in the communities that we serve.
Given the multiplicity of foundations that have developed, how do they shape the agenda in the African context, especially in the attempt to direct African resources to meeting the SDGs? Is it supply-led? Is it demand-led? Is that an appropriate way of thinking about it at all?
In a South African context, there is a lot of money that's locked up for social investment. I think about the funding that's sitting in the mining sector, which is unclaimed for various reasons. In the UIF or Unemployment Fund, there's funding that's sitting there that hasn't been allocated, and there's talk around how does that get utilized and where should that be spent. In terms of broad-based endowments, there's roughly 30 to 40 billion rand sitting there that will be unlocked and going into the market as a lot of these deals start flowing. So the money is there in many ways, and it's how do we channel it to really address the needs in a very strategic and deliberate way, and how do we monitor that implementation over the long term. So for me, that is one of the most critical things, and then to ensure alignment with the SDGs.
I think first of all, let's have a division of, let's subdivide that question. First of all, let's ask what exists and how is that being spent. It's an online platform. It's called the SDG platform. You can check and you can look at where the funding is going. The funding that they say is going to Africa, and the recipients of those, the organizations that are receiving that funding. When we did this study for TWNA last year, none of them were African institutions that were receiving that funding, but they were doing work in Africa. That's number one. So I think that's very important for us, because one of the reasons why we've championed African philanthropy has been to say we want Africans on the table. That was one of the sort of the underlying cause for establishing even institutions like Trust Africa.
It baffles me how our leaders make decisions without data, and we end up with this big deficit. It's not because they've costed the SDGs program. How did they cost it without the data? So I would emphasize an investment plan, because it then helps in decision making, but also in policy making. I think that one of the challenges we are facing as a country is setting up policies that are not informed by data that's available on the ground. If you check how many of our countries have signed up to policies at the African Union, SADC, ECOWAS, you will find that they've signed up to more than 100% of their budget. We just did a study some point around those who signed up to the agriculture and 10%. Almost all of them have signed up to it, but when they went back to their country, they realized they signed up more than what we can provide. So that's the challenge that I think we have. But we have just started with this conversation. Some of the questions will be responded to in the following sessions as we proceed. I wanted to also mention that I think we are streaming live the conversation. So we are actually reaching people more than the ones who are in this call. Please join me in thanking the panel